Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story.
3 weeks after my wife's funeral, my son stood in my own living room in front of every guest we had and said, "Dad's too far gone to know what's happening anymore." I said nothing. I just smiled because 2 days earlier, I had already signed away everything he thought he was about to inherit. He had no idea his mother left me something worth $2.4 million and no idea what I was about to do with it. But that moment hadn't happened yet. Not on the morning this story really begins. My name is Alan Shepard. I'm 68 years old. And for 35 years, I worked the lock at Vicksburg, controlling the water that let barges and towboats pass safely up and down the Mississippi. It is not a job most people think about. Nobody watches the river and wonders who decided when the gates should open how much pressure the chamber could hold before the whole system buckled. But I knew. I spent half my life learning to read water the way other men read. Faces the small signs before a surge, the moment when calm water was about to turn dangerous. I met Mercy Raymond 41 years ago at a church supper 2 counties over. She had a 6-year-old son named Cedric from a marriage that had ended badly, and she was terrified that no man would want the weight of another man's child. I told her I didn't see a weight. I saw a boy who needed somebody steady. We were married within a year, and I never once thought of Cedric as anything other than mine. I taught him to fish off the levee. I sat up with him through fevers and failed algebra tests. When he graduated business school in Jackson, I cried harder than I had at my own wedding. Cedric never called me Dad easily, not at first. For the better part of a year, he called me Alan, careful and formal, like he was testing whether the word Dad belonged to someone else and always would. I never pushed him. I figured a boy earns his own timeline for that kind of thing. When he finally said it over a broken bicycle chain in the driveway of all things, I had to walk into the garage and stand there a minute before I trusted my voice again. Mercy kept her maiden name on certain papers, the trust her family had set up, mostly untouched, mostly forgotten by everyone but her. I never asked why. 30 years of marriage teaches you that some doors don't need opening, only respecting. 3 weeks ago, that steadiness I'd built my whole life around came apart in a hospital corridor. Mercy's heart, which had never given either of us a moment's worry, simply stopped keeping its rhythm. The doctors used words like sudden and unexpected. I remember nodding at them the way I used to nod at inspectors who told me a valve had failed without warning. I understood the language. I did not understand the loss. A lock is a simple thing in theory. You let water in you, let water build you, let it out slow and controlled, and something that couldn't move an inch before suddenly rises to meet the level it needs. The danger was never the water itself. The danger was doing it too fast, letting pressure build somewhere nobody was watching until it found the weakest seam in the wall and went through it instead of over it. I spent 35 years making sure that never happened on my river. I did not yet understand I would spend the next few weeks doing the same thing inside my own family. The house has been unbearably quiet since the funeral. I still make 2 cups of coffee most mornings before I remember. I sit in my chair by the window that looks out over the water, and some evenings I find myself reaching for the small brass pressure gauge I kept from my last year at the lock, a retirement gift mostly ornamental. Now, though I still know exactly what a needle in the red means, I turn it over in my hand sometimes. It has no water pressure to measure anymore, only mine. Cedric and Juliet came for the funeral, of course, and for a few days after. They said the right things. They held my hand at the graveside and told me I wasn't alone. Then they went back to Jackson, back to their own lives, and I was left to walk through room after room of a house that suddenly felt 3 sizes too large for one old man and his memories. I told myself that was simply what grief looked like. I told myself the ache in my chest when the phone didn't ring was ordinary, that children grieve in their own way and at their own distance. I had no reason yet to think otherwise. I had built my whole life on trusting systems that had never failed me before my marriage. My son, the quiet understanding that love once given honestly doesn't need constant checking. 3 days ago, an attorney I had never heard of called my house and asked me to come to his office. He said it concerned a private matter Mercy had arranged years earlier, something separate from the will we'd read together at the funeral home. I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone against my ear, genuinely confused, running back through 4 decades of Sunday mornings at the kitchen table where Mercy and I had gone over every bill, every account, every plan for our future, together, always together. We had no secrets I would have told you, not one. 3 weeks after my wife's funeral, I still believed that. I had no idea how much was about to change, about the money, about a company on the river I had never once heard her mention owning a piece of, and about the 2 people I trusted most in this world sitting in my living room, already deciding I wouldn't be around long enough to matter. Mercy's illness didn't announce itself the way I always imagined illness would. There was no slow decline, no months of warning signs I could look back on and organize into a story that made sense. She'd complained of tiredness for maybe 2 weeks, the kind any 66-year-old woman might blame on the heat or a poor night's sleep. Then, one Tuesday morning, she couldn't catch her breath climbing the porch steps, and by that evening we were in an emergency room in Jackson, waiting on a cardiologist to tell us words I didn't want to hear. They admitted her. They ran tests. For 9 days, I sat in a vinyl chair beside her bed watching monitors. I understood better than the doctors probably assumed, given my years reading pressure gauges and flow meters for a living. A heart, I came to learn, isn't so different from a locked chamber. It has to hold a rhythm, has to manage pressure through valves too small to see, has to keep letting things in and out without ever losing the timing. Mercy's had been managing that rhythm just fine for 66 years. Then without any warning I could name it stopped. I was in the cafeteria getting coffee when it happened. Cedric had driven up from Jackson that morning and was sitting with her while I took a break I'd convinced myself I needed. I've replayed that decision more times than I can count. If I'd stayed in the room, if I'd been holding her hand instead of standing in a fluorescent-lit hallway with a paper cup going cold in my grip, I know logically that presence wouldn't have changed the outcome. Grief doesn't care much for logic. By the time I got back upstairs, there were already people in scrubs moving fast, and Cedric was standing pressed against the wall outside her room, his face gone the color of the tile floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I've spent 35 years learning to read the first signs of a system failing, and I read them on my son's face before anyone spoke a single word to me. The funeral was 3 days later at the little Baptist church off Washington Street where Mercy had sung in the choir for 2 decades. Half of Vicksburg turned out it felt like men I'd worked alongside on the river women from her garden club, the mailman who'd been delivering to our house since before Cedric could walk. Cedric gave a short eulogy. His voice cracked twice. I remember thinking, even through my own grief, how much he looked like a boy, again, standing up there, the same boy who used to grip my hand crossing the street. Juliet sat beside him the whole service, her hand resting on his knee, her expression composed in a way that struck me at the time as simple strength. I didn't think much of it. Grief looks different on everyone. I had no reason then to wonder whether composed and calculating might on occasion wear the same face. That was 3 weeks ago now. 3 weeks of a house so quiet I've started talking to it the way some widowers talk to photographs. I have learned the particular silence of a refrigerator hum with no other sound to compete against it. I've learned that grief has a schedule of its own. It doesn't come at the funeral or the reception or even the first night alone. It comes on a random Wednesday afternoon when you reach for 2 coffee mugs out of habit and only need one. Cedric calls most days, which I'm grateful for, though the calls are shorter than they used to be, and there's a carefulness in his voice, I've told myself, is grief too rather than anything else. Juliet calls less often, but when she does, she asks after my health with a thoroughness that seems in hindsight less like concern and more like inventory. At the time, I only heard a daughter-in-law worrying about a lonely old man. I had built my whole life on trusting the instruments in front of me. It never once occurred to me the readings could be faked. Mercy used to say I was the only man she knew who could sit with silence and not need to fill it. She meant it as a compliment mostly. These past 3 weeks I've wondered if it was also a warning I never fully understood, that a man comfortable with quiet can go a long time without noticing something is wrong simply because he isn't listening for it. I was sitting in that quiet on a Thursday morning, coffee gone cold on the side table, staring at nothing in particular, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Jackson area code, a firm name I'd never heard before, printed nowhere I could see it, just a man's voice, polite and unhurried, introducing himself as an attorney named Lachlan Hart. He said he was calling on behalf of a private matter Mercy had arranged separate from the estate documents Cedric and I had already gone through with our family lawyer. He said it would be better discussed in person than over the phone. He asked if I could come to his office in Vicksburg that afternoon. I sat with the phone still against my ear after he'd said goodbye, running through every conversation Mercy and I had ever had about money, about property, about the future, every Sunday morning at that kitchen table, every joint decision we'd made in 41 years of marriage. I couldn't think of a single thing we hadn't shared. I told myself it was probably nothing. A forgotten insurance policy, a small account she'd meant to mention and simply hadn't gotten around to. I put on a clean shirt, got in the truck, and drove into town with no particular sense of urgency, a man who still believed with everything in him that he already knew the whole shape of his wife's life. Lachlan Hart's office sat above a hardware store on Washington Street, the kind of second-floor law practice that had probably occupied the same room since before I was born, worn hardwood, a window unit rattling against the September heat. The receptionist told me Mr. Hart was expecting me. I sat less than 5 minutes, long enough to notice the framed diplomas and a photograph of a much younger Lachlan Hart beside a man I assumed was his father, both in the same tailored gray suits. He came out to meet me himself. He was a tall man, maybe 58, with the kind of steady handshake that told you he'd spent a career learning exactly how much pressure to apply and where. I liked him before he'd said 10 words, the same competence I used to recognize in men who knew their systems cold rather than bluffing their way through them. His private office was smaller than I expected, lined with case files instead of leather-bound decoration. He gestured me into a chair and sat down without the small talk I'd braced for. "Mr. Shepard," he said, "thank you for coming on short notice. I want to start by saying I'm very sorry for your loss. Mercy was a client of this firm for a long time, and she was, in my experience, one of the most careful people I've ever worked with." I asked what he meant by careful. He opened a folder on his desk. Though he didn't really need to look at it, he'd clearly gone over the contents more than once before I arrived. "Your wife came to see me roughly 11 years ago," he said, "and asked me to help her set up a private trust separate from your joint estate planning. She was very specific about the terms. The trust was to remain entirely confidential during her lifetime, funded from an inheritance on her side of the family that predated your marriage, and it was to pass to you and only you upon her death, not to your son, not to anyone else, you specifically by name." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, the way I used to turn over a report from an inspector that didn't quite match what my own gauges were telling me. "Mercy never mentioned a trust," I said. "In 41 years, she never once mentioned anything like that." "She was very clear with me about her reasons," Lachlan said, not unkindly. "She told me she had watched money change people she loved back when she was young, before you knew her, before Cedric. She said she wanted her son raised, believing the family had exactly what it appeared to have, nothing more, so that he'd build his own sense of worth rather than waiting on an inheritance. She told me more than once that she trusted you completely with the truth eventually. She simply wanted the timing to be hers." I thought about the boy who used to call me Alan for a year before he trusted the word Dad. I thought about how carefully Mercy and I had raised him to believe hard work was the only inheritance that mattered, and for the first time I wondered whether that had been a shared conviction between us, or one she'd quietly steered from the very beginning for reasons she'd never fully explained even to me. "What exactly is in this trust?" I asked. Lachlan slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, Not the full documentation, just a summary page. I read the top line twice before the number settled into something my brain could actually process. A minority ownership stake a little over 30% in a river logistics and barge transport company operating out of Vicksburg and Natchez. Current appraised value according to the most recent audit conducted 8 months earlier, $2.4 million. I set the paper down more carefully than the moment required, the way you set something down when your hands aren't steady and you don't want anyone to notice. "There's more," Lachlan said. "The physical documentation, the original ownership certificates, and a letter she asked me to keep sealed for you. She was specific that you should read it in private, not here in my office. It's all held in a safe deposit box at First Vicksburg Bank 2 blocks from here. She listed you as the sole beneficiary with immediate access upon her death, no probate delay required for the box itself." He reached into his desk drawer and slid a small brass key across the desk toward me, along with a card bearing the bank's address and a box number written in Mercy's own handwriting. I looked at that handwriting for a long moment. Even now in a lawyer's office I'd never set foot in before an hour ago. Some part of me expected her to walk in behind me and explain the whole thing herself, the way she'd explained everything else in 41 years of marriage. "Mr. Shepard," Lachlan said gentler now, "I know this is a great deal to absorb. I'd encourage you to go to the bank today while the key is fresh in your hand and the shock is fresh in your mind. Sometimes it's easier to face something enormous before you've had time to build a wall around it." I thanked him, folded the card and key into my shirt pocket, and walked the 2 blocks to the bank without any clear memory of the September heat or the cars passing or anything at all, except the small, hard shape of that brass key pressed against my chest with every step. I gave my name to the woman at the front desk, and she led me back through a heavy door into a room lined with numbered steel boxes, the air noticeably cooler than the lobby, smelling faintly of metal and dust. She found my box, inserted her master key alongside mine, and stepped back to give me privacy. I stood there a moment before I turned the key, my hand not quite steady, staring at a box that supposedly held $2.4 million worth of a truth my wife had kept from me for 11 years. The lid came up heavier than I expected, the hinges stiff from years of sitting undisturbed. Inside, resting on the top of everything else, was a single cream-colored envelope with my name written across it in Mercy's handwriting. Not the rushed cursive she used for grocery lists, but the careful, deliberate script she reserved for things that mattered. Underneath the envelope sat a slim folder of legal documents, and beneath that a bundle of stock certificates bound with a faded rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I set the folder and the certificates aside without opening them. I needed to read her words first, before the numbers had a chance to get in the way. I sat down on the small stool the bank had left in the room, tore the envelope open along the seam, and unfolded 3 pages covered front and back in her handwriting. The ink had faded slightly at the edges, which told me she'd written it years ago and simply let it wait, the way she let so many things wait until their proper time. "My dearest Alan," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I imagine you're sitting somewhere quiet, probably confused, possibly a little hurt that I kept something from you for this long. I want you to know that keeping this from you was the hardest secret I ever carried, and I carried it because I loved you and Cedric more than I was afraid of you being angry with me." She went on to explain what Lachlan had already told me in broader strokes, that the shares had come from her father's side, from a man she rarely spoke of, a man whose money had arrived with strings that eventually strangled every relationship it touched. She wrote that she'd watched 2 of her cousins destroy themselves, waiting on inheritances that never made them happy, only entitled, and she'd made up her mind long before she met me that no child of hers would grow up believing money would simply appear if he waited long enough. "I know you always believed hard work was something we taught Cedric together," she wrote, "and it was mostly. But I want to be honest with you even now. I steered that lesson harder than I ever told you because I was more frightened of what money could do to him than I ever let on. I hope by the time you're reading this, he's grown into a man who never needed to know the difference. I hope I was right to be so careful. If I was wrong, if he needed the truth sooner than I gave it to him, I'm sorry. That mistake, if it is one, is entirely mine, not yours. I had to stop reading there for a moment. My eyes had gone hot, and I pressed the heel of my hand against them the way I hadn't done since the hospital corridor 3 weeks earlier. There was something in the shape of that apology. I'm sorry, that mistake is mine, that felt less like closure and more like a door swinging open onto a room I hadn't known existed. I read the rest slower. She explained that the shares had grown considerably since she'd first inherited them, that the company had expanded its barge routes along the Mississippi corridor, ways her father could never have predicted, and that whatever the current value turned out to be, it was hers to give and now mine to decide what to do with. She asked only one thing of me directly, that I use it in a way that would have made Cedric proud of both of us rather than resentful of what we'd withheld. Use it to build something, not just to give something away all at once, she wrote near the bottom. Money handed over too fast in too large a sum has a way of revealing things about people that a slower hand never would have uncovered. You'll know the right way when the moment comes. You always have. I read that last line 3 times before I folded the letter back along its original creases and slid it into my breast pocket close against my chest, the same place I'd carried the brass key an hour before. I opened the folder. Next deed transfers an original stock certificate with a company seal I didn't recognize, a summary of quarterly distributions that had apparently been accumulating in a separate account for years untouched. I didn't examine the numbers closely. I would have time for that. What I wanted sitting alone in that cold metal room was simply to feel close to her one more time, and for a few minutes reading her handwriting I had. I gathered everything back into my briefcase, thanked the woman at the front desk on my way out, and walked to my truck in the parking lot behind the bank. The September sun had shifted while I'd been inside, throwing long shadows across the asphalt, and I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, letting the weight of the afternoon settle into something I could actually carry. By the time I pulled out onto Washington Street, my mind had already moved past the shock and into something warmer, something almost hopeful. I thought about Cedric, about the mortgage payments he'd mentioned feeling tight lately, about Juliet's offhand comment a few weeks back regarding the cost of his firm's malpractice insurance. I thought about how good it would feel to sit them both down and tell them their mother had left us more than any of us ever imagined, not to hand it over recklessly the way she'd warned against, but to finally stop watching my only son carry burdens I now had the means to lighten. I drove home with the radio off, rehearsing in my head exactly how I'd tell him already, picturing the relief on his face. I had no idea pulling into my own driveway that afternoon how differently that conversation was about to go. I saw the cars before I saw anything else, a dozen of them lining both sides of the street, nosed up against curbs where no one usually parked. For one disoriented second, I thought I'd gotten the day wrong, that I was somehow reliving the funeral itself. Then I remembered. Cedric had mentioned it weeks ago in the flat, dutiful voice he used for anything scheduling related, a 1-month memorial gathering, a small reception at the house, for people who couldn't make the funeral or wanted to sit with us again now that the first shock had passed. I'd agreed to it without much thought at the time. Grief makes you agreeable in ways you don't examine closely. I sat in the truck a moment longer than I needed, to my briefcase on the passenger seat, holding $2.4 million worth of a secret I'd planned on sharing with exactly 2 people quietly over coffee. Not like this. Not with half of Vicksburg's Baptist choir circulating through my living room with paper plates of deviled eggs. I went in anyway. There wasn't really another option. The house was fuller than I expected. Voices layered over each other in that particular hum of a southern gathering, equal parts sorrow and casserole. I recognized most of the faces, men from the River, women from Mercy's Garden Club, our pastor deep in conversation near the fireplace with 2 of the deacons. Someone had set out a folding table of food. I hadn't asked anyone to prepare casserole dishes, and a sheet cake with Mercy's name written in blue icing, as if grief required its own catering. I nodded my way through the entryway. accepting condolences I'd already heard 3 weeks ago, my mind only half present, the other half still turning over the shape of Mercy's handwriting. Our pastor caught my arm as I passed and told me with real warmth that Mercy's absence from the choir loft last Sunday had left a gap nobody could quite fill. I thanked him and moved on before my composure had a chance to slip in front of 30 people holding paper plates. It was Juliet I noticed first, standing near the bay window with a stack of glossy folded papers tucked under one arm. She'd worn a fitted gray suit to the funeral, and she'd worn one again today, the same sharp cut, the same particular shade, gray, the color of river water before a storm. I remember thinking in the half-second before anything else registered that it suited her. Composed, professional, the kind of outfit a woman wears when she wants a room to take her seriously without her having to raise her voice. She caught my eye across the room and smiled the smile she always gave me, warm enough to pass casual inspection, though something behind it never quite reached the rest of her face. I'd noticed that before over the years and always assumed it was simply her nature. Some people's warmth just runs a little cooler at the surface than others. I had no reason, standing in my own living room with my wife's letter still folded against my chest, to think it might be something else entirely. I remember oddly that Mercy had once teased Juliet gently about that same gray suit, told her at some family dinner years back that she dressed like a woman heading into a courtroom rather than a Sunday supper. Juliet had laughed it off then. I hadn't thought about that exchange in years, until it surfaced, now unbidden, standing in the doorway of my own kitchen. Cedric found me near the kitchen doorway. He hugged me the way he had at the funeral, one firm arm around my shoulders, and asked how I was holding up in a tone that sounded rehearsed, even though I knew he meant it. I told him I was managing. I didn't mention the bank. I didn't mention the letter. I wanted to tell him privately, the two of us, the way Mercy and I would have discussed anything that mattered. That was when I noticed the papers Juliet had been carrying weren't memorial programs or guest sign-in sheets. She'd set a small stack of them on the coffee table, and as I passed one, slid loose enough for me to catch the header printed across the top in bold, confident type, a real estate brokerage logo, and beneath it a glossy photograph of a house that looked remarkably similar to my own, same brick facade, same porch railing. Mercy and I had repainted 3 summers ago. I stopped walking. Something in my chest went very still, the way it used to when a gauge reading came in slightly off, and every instinct I had told me to check it twice before assuming it was nothing. I said, keeping my voice level. What exactly is this? He followed my gaze to the coffee table, and for just a moment, half a second, maybe less, something crossed his face that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't far from it either. He opened his mouth to answer. Behind him I saw Juliet set down her drink and begin moving toward us with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who'd already rehearsed exactly what came next. The room hadn't gone quiet yet, but it was about to. Juliet reached us before Cedric found his words, and I understood, watching the two of them exchange a glance, that whatever was about to happen had been discussed between them long before I walked through my own front door. "Alan," she said, using my first name, the way she always had, warm and easy. "We didn't want to spring this on you today of all days. But since you're asking—" She let the sentence trail, glancing at Cedric as though handing him a baton he hadn't quite agreed to carry. Cedric cleared his throat. The room hadn't gone fully silent, but nearby conversations had thinned the way they do when people sense something happening and pretend not to notice while listening carefully. "Dad, we've been talking," he said, "about the house. About whether it still makes sense for you to be here alone in a place this size with everything that's happened." "It's my house, Cedric," I said. "I've lived in it 30 years longer than you have." "I know." His voice cracked slightly, and for 1 second, I saw something genuine underneath the rehearsed calm, a flicker of the boy who used to grip my hand crossing the street. Then it was gone, smoothed back over. "But you're 70 years old and alone now, and Mom's not here to help you manage things anymore, and Juliet and I really think it's time to consider something smaller, safer." I felt the weight of the briefcase strap still crossed over my shoulder, the letter folded against my chest beneath my shirt. $2.4 million sat inches from where my own son was suggesting I could no longer be trusted to manage a mortgage payment. "Is that what the flyers are?" I said. "You've already found buyers." Juliet's composure didn't crack, not even slightly. If anything, it sharpened the way a person's focus sharpens right before they say something they've been rehearsing for days. She raised her voice not loud, but pitched precisely enough to carry to the small cluster of neighbors still lingering near the fireplace, precisely enough that I understood, even as she spoke, that this was not a private conversation anymore. It had never been meant to be one. "We didn't want to say this in front of everyone," she said in a tone that made it very clear she intended exactly that. "But honestly, Alan, Dad's too far gone to know what's happening anymore." The words landed the way a valve failure lands, not loud, not violent, just suddenly and completely wrong. A system you trusted, showing you the exact moment it stopped holding pressure the way it should. I felt the room's attention shift toward me, the way water shifts toward an open gate, inevitable physics rather than choice. Mrs. Halloway from the garden club stopped mid-sentence. Our pastor's eyes found mine, and then carefully found somewhere else to look. I understood in that half-second that Juliet hadn't misspoken in front of an audience. She had built the audience on purpose, the same way you'd build a case before a jury, witnesses who'd remember later that they'd heard it themselves, that the daughter-in-law had only been voicing what everyone privately worried about anyway. I could have argued. Every instinct in me wanted to set the briefcase down on that coffee table, right on top of the real estate flyers, and open it in front of every single person in that room. I wanted to watch their faces change. I wanted Cedric to understand immediately and completely exactly how wrong he was. I didn't do any of that. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. Something I couldn't have explained in the moment, except that 35 years of reading pressure gauges teaches you that the worst possible response to a sudden reading is a sudden reaction. You don't slam a valve shut the second something looks wrong. You watch, you wait, you let the system show you more of itself before you decide what it's actually telling you. I smiled. Not the tight, wounded smile of a man who'd just been humiliated in his own living room. A real one, small and quiet, the kind that made Juliet's confident expression falter for just a fraction of a second, long enough that I saw it, even if no one else in that room did. "Thank you both for thinking of me," I said, steady, almost gentle. "I should probably go lie down. It's been a long day." I turned and walked toward my bedroom, leaving the coffee table, the flyers, and my own son standing in the wreckage of a sentence he wouldn't be able to take back no matter how this ended. I didn't look back at their faces. I didn't need to. I'd spent 35 years believing the right response to pressure was patience, that a system given enough honest time would eventually show its true reading rather than a false one. I had built my entire life on that belief, my marriage, my son every quiet Sunday morning at that kitchen table. Walking away from the one room where I should have felt most entitled to raise my voice, I understood that the same patience that made me a good husband, and I'd always believed a good father, might also be the very thing that had let something rot for years without my noticing. I closed my bedroom door softly behind me, more out of habit than need. The murmur of the gathering had already resumed. Outside voices, smoothing back over the gap. Juliet's words had torn open the way water closes over a stone the moment it settles. I sat on the edge of the bed. Mercy and I had shared for 3 decades, the briefcase still across my shoulder, and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened in front of 30 witnesses who would remember it exactly the way Juliet had intended. I did not cry. I did not shake. I sat still the way I used to sit in the control room during a storm surge, watching numbers climb toward a red line, waiting to see how bad it was going to get before deciding what to do about it. The last guests left a little after 8, and I heard Cedric and Juliet's voices in the kitchen for a while after that, low and clipped, the particular tone of 2 people arguing quietly enough not to be overheard and not quite succeeding. I stayed in my bedroom with the door closed, the briefcase locked in the bottom drawer of my dresser, beneath a stack of winter sweaters Mercy had folded there years ago, and I told myself, I wasn't listening. I was listening. I simply couldn't make out the words through the wall. Around 9, I heard the front door open and close, Cedric and Juliet leaving for their own house across town, the way they had every night since the funeral, never once suggesting they stay over, never once asking if I wanted company in a home that had grown 3 sizes too large for one old man. I waited another 20 minutes after the sound of their car faded down the street before I opened my bedroom door. I told myself I was only going to the kitchen for water. That part at least was true when I started walking. The house looked different, empty of guests, folding chairs still stacked against the dining room wallpaper, plates half filled with food. No one had finished the particular disarray of a gathering that had ended before anyone got around to cleaning it up. I made my way toward the kitchen, and it was passing through the den that I saw a manila folder left open on the side table beside the armchair. Cedric had been sitting in most of the afternoon papers, fanned out slightly, where he'd apparently set it down in a hurry and forgotten to close it before he left. I shouldn't have looked. I told myself that even as I was already reaching for it. The top page was a standard legal form, the kind of document I'd signed 100 times over the years for insurance claims and property transfers, at the locked-dense paragraphs of boilerplate language. A signature line at the bottom, a small red notary seal stamped beside it. The header read, "Durable Power of Attorney," in bold black letters, and beneath that my full legal name typed in the space reserved for the principal granting authority. I read it standing there in the half-dark den, my eyes moving faster than my brain could properly process each sentence. The document granted full and unconditional authority over my financial accounts, my real estate holdings, and my medical decisions to Cedric Allen Newman, effective immediately upon execution, no expiration date specified. At the bottom, beside the notary's raised seal, was a signature. My signature, my name in the particular slant and rhythm I'd used my entire adult life, the same hand that had signed 35 years of maintenance logs at the lock, the same hand that had signed Mercy's hospital consent forms 3 weeks ago, in a corridor I still couldn't think about without my chest tightening. I set the folder down and walked to the small writing desk in the corner of the den, the one Mercy had used for correspondence, and pulled a blank sheet of paper from the drawer. I signed my own name on it quickly, the way I always did, the way I'd done 10,000 times without thinking. I held the 2 signatures side by side under the lamp. They were close. Whoever had done this had studied my handwriting carefully, the particular loop on the capital A, the way I let the S in Shepherd trail slightly upward at the end. Close enough to fool a notary who wasn't looking too hard, or a notary who'd been paid not to look hard at all. But not close enough to fool the man whose hand had actually made that signature 10,000 times before. The pressure was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. It was the handwriting of someone imitating confidence rather than possessing it. I stood there a long moment, the lamp humming faintly, the 2 pages trembling slightly in my hands, though I couldn't have said whether it was my hands shaking or simply the old wiring in that lamp. 35 years reading gauges teaches you something specific about the moment a system fails. It rarely announces itself all at once. It gives you a single reading slightly off, easy enough to dismiss as instrument error. And then, if you're paying attention, it gives you a second reading that removes all doubt. The flyers on the coffee table had been the first reading. This was the second. I understood, standing in that quiet den with a forged document in my hands, that whatever I had walked into that afternoon was no longer a misunderstanding I could clear up over coffee. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make my own signature a weapon against me, and they had done it carefully enough and calmly enough that I no longer had any idea how long this had actually been in motion. I folded both papers carefully back along their original creases and returned them to the folder exactly as I'd found it. Papers fanned in the same disorder corners, aligned the same imprecise way. Whoever came looking for it in the morning would find nothing out of place. They would have no idea I had seen it at all. Not yet, not until I understood exactly how far this went and exactly what I intended to do about it. I didn't sleep much that night, though I made a point of looking like I had. By the time the sun came up through my bedroom blinds, I had already decided what the next several days needed to look like. And I decided it the way I used to plan a shutdown sequence at the lock, every step mapped out before I touched the first valve. Because half measures in a system under pressure only make the eventual failure worse. I shuffled into the kitchen a little after 8 wearing yesterday's undershirt instead of a clean one, my hair uncombed, moving slower than I needed to. It wasn't difficult exactly. Grief had already worn a real groove into my body over the past 3 weeks. The stooped shoulders, the general heaviness in my limbs, and all I had to do was lean into what was already halfway true and let it look like more. Cedric called around 9, his voice careful in the particular way it had been since the memorial testing the ground before he put his full weight on it. He asked how I was doing after yesterday. I told him in a voice I let waver more than it needed to, that I didn't remember much of yesterday, clearly that the whole afternoon had gone soft and strange. In my memory, faces blurring together, and I wasn't sure why. I heard something shift in his tone on the other end of the line, not quite relief but close to it, the particular relief of a man whose worst-case plan is suddenly looking easier than expected. Juliet came by that afternoon alone, carrying a small paper bag from the pharmacy on Clay Street. She let herself in with the spare key Mercy had given her years ago, the way she always had, and found me sitting in my chair by the window, staring out at the water, the way I genuinely had been doing most mornings since the funeral, though today I made sure to let my eyes stay unfocused a beat too long when she said my name. "Alan," she said, crouching beside my chair with the particular gentleness of someone speaking to a child or an invalid. "I picked something up for you. I've been reading about grief and memory. It's actually very common what's happening to you. The stress hormones can really do a number on cognitive function, especially at your age, especially after something this sudden." She pulled a bright orange bottle from the bag. The label read a name I didn't recognize, something with the word clarity worked into it, the kind of product that promised everything and specified nothing. Natural herbal support for memory and mental focus. The smaller print said, alongside a list of ingredients I couldn't have pronounced if I'd tried. "I already sorted out a week's worth," she said, producing a plastic pill organizer, the kind with a compartment for each day, and setting it on the side table beside my chair. "One every morning with breakfast. I'll refill it each week so you don't have to think about it." I looked at the little plastic compartments, each one holding a single capsule, Monday through Sunday, and felt something I couldn't entirely name, not suspicion. Yet not really, just the faint unease of a man being handed a solution to a problem he hadn't fully agreed he had. "That's kind of you," I said, and I meant it to sound grateful and slightly confused, the exact register I'd decided on the night before. Inside, though, I was doing something closer to what I used to do, reading an unfamiliar gauge reading for the first time, noting the number, filing it away, refusing to react until I understood what it actually meant. I could have refused the pills outright. I could have told her right there that I felt perfectly clear-headed and didn't need anything from a pharmacy shelf. Some part of me, the part that was still, despite everything, a husband who trusted the woman his son had married, a father who wanted badly to believe the worst explanation wasn't the true one, wanted to give her every benefit of every doubt I had left. But another part of me, colder and more patient, understood that refusing would tell her I was paying closer attention than she wanted me to be. And I'd already decided somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn that the only way to find out how deep this went was to let them believe completely that I was exactly as far gone as they needed me to be. "Take the Monday one now if you want," Juliet said, watching me with an attentiveness that might have looked like tenderness to anyone who hadn't seen the same woman's composure crack just barely the afternoon before. "No sense waiting until tomorrow?" I picked up the capsule between 2 fingers. It sat there small and orange, entirely ordinary, and I understood holding it that I had just made a choice, not about the pill itself, not yet, but about the man I was going to let them believe I'd become. I swallowed it with a sip of water and thanked her again, and watched her smile settle into something that looked for just a moment like satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a woman checking the first item off a very long list. 2 days into playing a man who couldn't be trusted with his own house, I discovered the exhausting part wasn't the acting itself. It was the loneliness of it, carrying a secret so heavy inside a performance so complete that I had no one left to set it down with, not even for an hour. I needed somewhere to just sit unwatched and think without an audience. I found myself walking to the little coffee shop on Levy Street most mornings that week, the one Mercy and I used to visit on Saturdays before her choir practice, back when a cup of coffee together was just a cup of coffee and not a piece of evidence in a performance I was giving for an audience of 2. Nobody there knew about the memorial scene, the forged document, any of it. For 20 minutes at a time, I could simply be an old man drinking coffee by a window that looked out over the water. The woman behind the counter had started recognizing my order by the second visit. Black coffee, no room, the same thing Mercy used to order from me before I'd finished asking. Her name tag read Kailani, and she had the kind of easy attentiveness that made regulars feel remembered without ever making a show of it. "Rough couple weeks?" she asked on my third visit, sliding my cup across the counter without my having said a word about myself. I told her honestly enough that my wife had passed recently. She didn't offer the practiced condolences I'd been hearing for 3 weeks straight, the ones that came preloaded with a particular cadence, delivered and forgotten in the same breath. She just said she was sorry plainly and let the silence sit there a moment instead of rushing to fill it. I appreciated that more than I could have explained. I came back the next morning and the one after that, and by the end of the week she'd started setting my coffee down and pulling up the stool behind the counter for a few minutes when the shop was slow the way you do with someone whose grief you've decided to simply witness rather than manage. She told me in bits over those mornings that she'd moved to Vicksburg from Honolulu 6 years back to help care for her grandmother, and that the coffee shop had become something closer to a second home than a job. I found myself looking forward to those few quiet minutes more than I probably should have admitted to anyone. It was on that Thursday, my coffee gone lukewarm in my hands, that she mentioned it offhand the way people mention things that mean nothing to them and everything to someone else. "Had the strangest customer in here a few weeks back," Kailani said, wiping down the espresso machine without really looking at me. "Woman in this sharp gray suit, like courtroom gray, you know the kind. Sat right where you're sitting now, actually, and started asking me all these questions about my grandmother's heart medication. Real specific stuff. What it looked like, how fast it worked, whether you'd notice if the dosage got messed with somehow." I set my cup down carefully. "She said her mother-in-law had the same prescription," Kailani went on, "and she was worried about mixing something up. I figured it was one of those caretaker things, people get paranoid when they're managing somebody else's pills. I told her what I knew my grandmother's on the same kind of heart medicine, similar dosing schedule, and she thanked me and left. Never saw her again until, actually, hang on, I think that might have been her across the street week or so ago. Same suit. I only remember because nobody dresses like that around here except for court days." "What did she look like?" I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "Besides the suit?" Kailani thought about it, tilting her head. "Younger than you'd expect for the whole caretaker thing, 30s maybe. Real polished. Talked fast like she was used to people not having much time for her." She shrugged. "Why, you know her?" I told her I wasn't sure. That was strictly speaking true. I had no proof sitting there with my coffee going cold that the woman Kailani was describing was anyone I knew at all. Vicksburg wasn't a large town, but it wasn't so small that gray suits and heart medication questions belonged to only one person in it. But I thought of Juliet standing in my living room 3 days ago, the particular shade of that gray suit, the way Mercy had once teased her about dressing for a courtroom. I thought of the pill organizer sitting on my side table at home, the orange bottle promising clarity it had never actually delivered. And I thought, though, I told myself it was probably nothing, that I had no earthly reason to be as unsettled as I suddenly was by a stranger's second-hand story about a woman asking careful questions in a coffee shop weeks before my wife had died. I didn't have an answer yet. I only had a feeling cold and precise of a gauge reading. I couldn't quite place a number that didn't belong anywhere in the system. I thought I understood sitting there anyway, waiting for me to figure out what it meant. Sleep had become a stranger to me by that point, and not entirely because of grief anymore. I lay in the bed Mercy and I had shared for 30 years, staring at the same water-stained patch on the ceiling I'd meant to fix for a decade, running the same loop of information through my head over and over, trying to find the seam where it all connected. A forged power of attorney, a pill organizer filled with something called clarity that had so far delivered none. A gray suit and a stranger's questions about heart medication asked weeks before Mercy's heart had simply stopped keeping time. Individually, each piece could be explained away: a son's misguided attempt at control, an overpriced supplement, a coincidence of fashion and worry. I had spent 35 years learning not to trust individual readings in isolation, though. A single gauge could lie. A pattern across multiple gauges reading in the same direction rarely did. I told myself I was building a case out of grief and paranoia, the way a man alone in a too-quiet house sometimes builds monsters out of ordinary shadows. I told myself that more than once that night, and I didn't believe it any of the times I said it. Mercy used to tell me I worried like an engineer, even about things that had nothing to do with pressure or flow, that I turned every uncertainty over in my hands until it either made sense or wore smooth from the handling. She meant it fondly most of the time. Lying there alone, I wondered whether that same habit was finally serving some real purpose, or whether grief had simply given my mind a new set of gauges to obsess over that weren't actually telling me anything at all. Around 1 in the morning, I gave up on sleep altogether and lay there instead with my eyes open, listening to the house settle around me. The way old houses do the particular creak of the hallway floorboard outside my door, the low hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away, sounds so familiar I usually didn't register them at all. That night, I registered everything. I'd trained myself for decades to notice the difference between a system running normally and a system running normally, except for one detail slightly out of place, and some part of my mind, even sleepless and exhausted, refused to stop scanning for it. By 2, my throat had gone dry enough that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I threw back the blankets and swung my legs over the side of the bed, moving slowly out of habit rather than necessity. The performance of frailty had become so constant over the past week that I sometimes caught myself doing it, even alone in the dark with no one to see. I didn't turn on any lights. I knew this house in the dark the way I'd known the lock chamber in the dark, every measurement memorized long before instinct needed to consult memory. I padded barefoot down the hallway, past the closed door of the guest room where Cedric and Juliet had stopped staying since the memorial, past the den where I'd found the forged document 3 nights earlier. Its folder no doubt still sitting exactly where I'd left it, waiting for someone to come looking. The kitchen tile was cold under my feet. I found a glass in the cabinet by feel rather than sight, and filled it at the tap, the water running loud in the particular silence of a sleeping house, silence so complete I could hear my own pulse if I paid attention to it. I raised the glass to drink, and it was then lowering it again that something outside caught the edge of my vision. A faint, unsteady light moving somewhere beyond the kitchen window, out past the bay window that looked over the back patio where Mercy used to keep her rose bushes. I went still. The house was empty except for me. Cedric and Juliet hadn't stayed over in weeks, hadn't so much as suggested it, always careful to leave before dark fell, the same way they'd been careful about everything since the funeral. There was no reason for a light out there at 2 in the morning. No reason at all, unless someone had let themselves in through the back gate the way family sometimes does, using a key that had never been taken back. I set the glass down on the counter as quietly as I could manage, my heart picking up a rhythm I hadn't felt in weeks, not since the hospital corridor. Not since the moment I'd first read the words, durable power of attorney, beneath my own forged signature. I moved toward the bay window, one slow step at a time, staying close to the wall, The old habits of a man who'd spent decades reading warning signs before they became emergencies, asserting themselves without my having to think about it at all. The light steadied as I got closer. Not a flashlight, I realized, but the pale blue glow of a phone screen held low, illuminating a figure standing out on the patio stones where Mercy's roses used to bloom every June. I pressed myself against the cool plaster beside the window frame and looked out into the dark, my breath caught somewhere high in my chest, waiting to see who exactly had come to my house in the middle of the night and why. It was Juliet. I recognized her even in the dark, even before my eyes fully adjusted the particular way she held herself, shoulders squared, even when she thought no one was watching, a posture built for boardrooms that never quite relaxed into anything else. She was standing exactly where Mercy's rose bushes used to bloom, phone held low in one hand, its pale light throwing strange shadows up across her face. She wasn't looking at the phone, though. Not really. She was pacing 3 steps one direction and 3 steps back, the movement of someone working through something that hadn't gone the way she'd planned. I stayed pressed against the wall, breathing as shallow as I could manage, watching her make another slow circuit of the patio stones. She stopped near the edge, crouched down, and set something on the low garden wall beside her, the pill organizer. My pill organizer, the same one that had been sitting on my side table for the better part of a week, Monday through Sunday, 1 capsule for every day I hadn't yet swallowed. I watched her open it. She worked quickly, methodically, the way a person handles something they've done many times before, popping open one of the little plastic compartments, removing the orange capsule inside, pulling it apart with a small, practiced twist between her fingers. Even from that distance in that light, I could see the fine powder inside, catch what little illumination the phone gave off before she tipped it out into the dirt at the base of where the rose bushes used to stand. My mind, for one long moment, simply refused to process what I was watching. Some part of me kept insisting there had to be an explanation that didn't end where this one seemed to be heading, that she was checking a dosage, correcting an error, doing anything other than what my eyes were plainly telling me she was doing. She reached into her jacket pocket then and produced a small plastic bag, the kind you'd use for loose change or spare buttons, except this one held something else. A fine white substance she began carefully measuring into the empty capsule shell with what looked, even from where I stood, like real precision. She snapped the 2 halves back together, checked her work under the phone light, and set the finished capsule back into its compartment exactly where the original had been. I thought of Kailani's story without meaning to, the details arriving all at once, instead of piece by piece, the way they had at the coffee shop. A woman in a sharp gray suit asking careful questions about heart medication weeks before Mercy died. What it looked like, how fast it worked, whether you'd notice if the dosage got messed with somehow. I had spent 3 weeks believing my wife's heart had simply tragically stopped on its own. Watching Juliet empty a capsule into the dirt where Mercy's roses used to grow, I understood with a clarity that felt almost violent in how completely it arrived that I no longer had any reason to believe that was true. She worked through 3 more capsules while I stood frozen against the cold plaster, my own pulse loud enough in my ears that I was half convinced she'd hear it across the yard. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Each one opened, emptied, refilled with the same careful precision, each one set back into its place, as though nothing had happened at all. I don't know exactly how long I stood there, long enough that my legs had begun to ache from holding perfectly still. Long enough to understand with total certainty that whatever I did next would have to be exactly as careful as what I was watching her do. Because a woman capable of this, capable of standing calmly in my backyard at 2 a.m, refilling capsules, meant for an old man's morning coffee, was not a woman who would hesitate to notice if I gave her any reason to look at me differently. Juliet snapped the organizer shut, tucked the empty bag back into her pocket, and straightened, glancing once toward the dark house before starting back toward the gate. I retreated from the window as silently as I'd approached it, my bare feet moving without sound across the kitchen tile. My mind already working through what I would need to do in the morning and every morning after, until I understood exactly how much of what remained of my life she believed she'd already taken from me. I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the dark kitchen for a long while afterward, listening to the gate latch click shut somewhere out past the roses, and I thought about the word Mercy had used in her letter, the word I hadn't fully understood until this moment. Careful. She'd called herself careful, protecting the people she loved from a danger she'd seen coming decades before I ever could. I wondered, sitting there in the dark, whether she'd ever imagined the word might one day describe the very person standing in her garden, undoing everything she'd tried to protect. I understood now that I would need to become exactly that kind of careful myself, and quickly, if I intended either of us to survive what was clearly still unfolding. Cedric came by around 10 that morning alone, carrying a folder of what he called estate paperwork and a laptop bag slung over one shoulder. He'd taken to using the den as a kind of temporary office. Since the funeral, he said, easier than driving back and forth from his own place, every time something needed a signature or a look. I let him in wearing the same unfocused expression I'd been wearing all week, moving slow, saying less than I meant, watching him arrange himself at the desk Mercy used to write her letters at. I studied him while he set up the way I used to study a system before deciding whether it needed adjustment or whether it was still holding steady on its own. He looked tired in a way that hadn't been there a month ago. New lines around his eyes, a stiffness in his shoulders he hadn't quite learned to carry naturally. If I hadn't watched his wife empty capsules into my garden dirt the night before, I might have mistaken it for ordinary grief. I had rehearsed this moment more than once in my head over the past several hours, lying awake after what I'd seen in the yard, running through every version of how it might unfold. What I hadn't planned on was how simple the opportunity would actually turn out to be. Cedric's phone rang 20 minutes into his visit. His office, from the way his voice shifted the moment he answered it, something about a client meeting that had apparently gone sideways. He excused himself, stepped out onto the back porch for privacy, the way he always did with work calls, and left his laptop sitting open on the desk. The screen dimmed, but not locked. A login prompt, waiting patiently behind a photograph of a beach somewhere I didn't recognize. I moved before I'd fully decided to move. I knew Cedric's habits well enough to guess at a password. Without much trouble, I'd bought him his first computer, had spent hours over the years helping him troubleshoot one system or another, had watched him type in enough variations of the same handful of personal details that guessing felt less like hacking and more like remembering. I tried the name of the dog he'd had as a boy, paired with the year he'd graduated business school. The screen unlocked on the second try. I didn't have long. I could hear his voice through the window, low and tense, the conversation apparently still unfolding. I opened his browser. First, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and went straight to his search history, filtering for anything from the past month. There was nothing about assisted living facilities, nothing about home care services, nothing about senior placement consultants, not one search that matched the concerned son narrative he and Juliet had been performing so carefully in front of witnesses. Whatever that glossy brochure on the coffee table had been the day of the memorial, it hadn't come from any research Cedric had actually done. What I found instead made my stomach turn cold. His search history was full of something else entirely online: poker platforms, offshore sports betting sites, forum threads about recovering from significant gambling losses, article after article with titles like "How Deep is Too Deep" and "When Debt Collectors Can Legally Contact You." I clicked through to his browser's saved logins without letting myself think too hard about what I was doing, and found an account dashboard for something called a private lending platform, the kind of site that didn't advertise on television. The number on the screen made my hands go still over the keyboard. $600,000, outstanding balance accruing interest daily. A payment history that showed nothing but minimums for the past 8 months, and a final notice dated just 11 days ago, threatening escalation if the full balance wasn't settled by a deadline. I could see circled in red at the top of the page: I did the arithmetic without meaning to the same automatic instinct that had spent decades converting flow rates and pressure readings into numbers that actually meant something. 8 months of minimum payments on a debt that size meant this had started well before Mercy ever got sick, meant whatever had driven him into this was already well underway, while the two of us still sat at that kitchen table on Sunday mornings, going over bills, believing we knew everything about each other worth knowing. I sat there in Mercy's chair, staring at a number that explained more than I wanted it to. Not the pills, not yet. But the flyers, the forged power of attorney, the urgency behind all of it, a son who needed money fast enough that patience had stopped being an option, and a house worth more than $1 million, sitting untouched in his father's name, doing nothing but gathering dust while the interest on his debt kept climbing. And in numbers that actually meant something. 8 months of minimum payments on a debt that size meant this had started well before Mercy ever got sick, meant whatever had driven him into this was already well underway, while the two of us still sat at that kitchen table on Sunday mornings, going over bills, believing we knew everything about each other worth knowing. I sat there in Mercy's chair, staring at a number that explained more than I wanted it to. Not the pills, not yet. But the flyers, the forged power of attorney, the urgency behind all of it, a son who needed money fast enough that patience had stopped being an option, and a house worth more than $1 million, sitting untouched in his father's name, doing nothing but gathering dust while the interest on his debt kept climbing. I heard the porch door creak outside Cedric's voice, trailing off into a goodbye. I closed the browser tab, locked the screen exactly as I'd found it, and stepped back from the desk, my heart hammering in a way I hoped my face wasn't showing. He came back inside a minute later, apologizing for the interruption, sliding back into the chair without any idea that the machine in front of him had just told me everything he'd been too ashamed or too afraid to say to my face himself. Cedric came back 3 days later, the same routine settling into place without either of us acknowledging it as a routine. The laptop, a folder of papers that needed my increasingly shaky signature on one thing or another. I'd started to notice, watching him from across the desk, that he rarely looked at me directly anymore for longer than a few seconds at a time, the way people avoid eye contact with something they have decided not to think about too carefully. I signed where he pointed, my hand deliberately unsteady, watching him gather the pages back into their folder, with the particular efficiency of a man checking items off a list he badly wanted finished. This time, when his phone buzzed, he didn't leave the room right away. He glanced at the screen, muttered something about needing to step out for reception, and left the laptop open on the desk exactly the way he had before. Already halfway convinced, I think, that his father's confusion had become permanent enough not to warrant much caution anymore. I didn't hesitate this time around. The password unlocked the same way it had before, and I went straight to his email client, scrolling past weeks of ordinary correspondence work, updates, calendar invites, a chain about weekend plans with old college friends, until a subject line caught my eye that didn't belong with any of it. Listing details. Confidential. The thread was between Juliet and a contact saved only as broker, no last name, no company signature, no letterhead of any kind. I opened it and read quickly, aware of the seconds ticking past outside on the porch. Juliet had written the first message 11 days ago, the same week I'd learned about the trust. List the property 20% under market, she'd written without preamble, without softening. We need it moved fast. Cash close preferred, no financing contingencies. I don't care about maximizing the number, I care about speed. The broker had asked in his reply whether the owner was aware of the pricing strategy, whether there might be complications with a sale that far under comparable value. Juliet's response was 3 lines long. Owner's health is declining rapidly. He's not in a position to evaluate the terms himself, and we hold medical power of attorney. There won't be any complications on our end. I read that line twice, my jaw tightening around words I couldn't say out loud without alerting Cedric through the window. Not in a position to evaluate the terms himself. written as calmly as a woman discussing weather about a man she'd been quietly poisoning for over a week, sitting not 30 feet away from where she'd typed it. I might have stopped there, might have closed the laptop and carried that single piece of evidence back to my bedroom to sit with if I hadn't scrolled one message further and noticed a separate folder Cedric had created labeled Simply Drafts Unsent. I shouldn't have opened it. I told myself that even as I was already clicking through. Inside was a single message composed but never sent, addressed to a name I recognized from a counseling practice in Jackson, a therapist based on the practice's website listed in his contacts. The message had no subject line. It read in its entirety, "I don't think I can keep doing this. I know what we're doing to him, and I don't know how to stop it without losing everything. And I don't know which one of those things scares me more anymore. I need someone to tell me I'm not the person I'm starting to think I am." The message was dated 9 days ago. It had never been sent. I sat very still in Mercy's chair, staring at those 2 sentences until the words blurred slightly at the edges. I thought about the boy who used to call me Alan for a year before he trusted the word Dad, testing whether that particular kind of belonging was real before he let himself believe in it. I thought about how carefully Mercy and I had tried to raise a man capable of exactly this kind of honesty with himself, and how thoroughly that honesty had apparently curdled into something he couldn't act on, only draft and delete over and over alone. It didn't excuse anything at all. I want to be clear with myself about that, even now sitting here writing this down. A man who knows he's doing wrong and does it anyway carries the same weight of consequence as a man who never questioned himself at all, maybe more in some ways, because ignorance was never his excuse to claim. But it told me something Juliet's cold, efficient emails never could have. It told me my son was still somewhere underneath 8 months of debt and desperation, and a wife who'd apparently stopped asking his permission for anything a man capable of knowing exactly how far he'd fallen. I closed the draft without sending it closed. The browser locked the screen. When Cedric came back in from the porch a few minutes later, I was sitting exactly where he'd left me, staring out the window with the particular unfocused expression I'd perfected over the past week, giving no indication at all that I now knew considerably more about my son than he had ever intended me to. The doorbell rang a little after 4 in the afternoon, 2 days after I'd read Cedric's unsent message, on a day when neither Cedric nor Juliet had mentioned coming by. I wasn't expecting deliveries. I wasn't expecting anyone at all, which was precisely why the sound of it sent a small current of unease through me before I'd even reached the front hallway. I looked through the narrow glass panel beside the door before opening it, an old habit from decades of working odd hours on the river, and found myself studying a man I'd never seen before in my life. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that seemed to strain the seams of his leather jacket, a thick tangle of tattoos climbing up one side of his neck toward his jaw, his expression flat in a way that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with a man who'd simply run out of interest in being polite. He didn't look like a salesman. He didn't look like anyone lost or confused searching for the wrong address. He looked, if I'm being honest, about the particular chill that ran through me in that moment, like trouble that had decided to come find me directly rather than wait for me to find it first. I hesitated with my hand on the deadbolt, weighing whether ignoring the bell might simply make him leave. Before I'd fully decided, his fist came down hard against the door, the sound of it echoing through the empty hallway with a force that rattled the small decorative mirror Mercy had hung there years ago. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice carrying easily through the heavy wood. "Open up. I'm not asking twice." I opened the door, leaving the chain lock fastened, some instinct telling me that a locked chain might buy a few seconds I could use, even if I couldn't have said for what. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, though the performance of frailty I'd been carrying for over a week suddenly felt like the wrong costume entirely for whatever this actually was. He didn't answer with words. He answered by driving his boot into the base of the door hard enough that the chain snapped clean, the metal fitting tearing loose from splintered wood, the door itself swinging inward with enough force to knock me backward into the hallway wall. I caught myself against the molding pain flaring bright and immediate through my shoulder, before I'd fully registered that he'd already crossed the threshold and closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He grabbed the collar of my shirt with one thick hand and hauled me upright against the wall, my feet barely finding purchase on the hardwood beneath me. Up close, he smelled of cigarette smoke and something sharper underneath it, and his eyes held the particular emptiness of a man who'd done this exact thing to other people, enough times that it no longer registered as anything worth feeling one way or another about. "You're Cedric's father," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what you're talking about." I managed my hands instinctively finding his wrist, though I had no illusions about my ability to actually move it. He laughed, a short, humorless sound that carried no warmth in it at all. "Your boy's been playing games with people who don't play games back. He thinks he can float on minimum payments forever and nobody's going to come collect. You tell him something for me." He leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath against my face. "Tell him the 600 is due in full by Friday, not Monday, not next week when he's got a better excuse ready. Friday? And if we have to come back here again, it won't be a conversation. It'll be a match and a gas can, and I don't much care whether you're standing in the house when we light it." He released his grip as abruptly as he'd taken it, and I dropped hard against the wall, my legs unsteady beneath me, for reasons that had nothing to do with any performance. I gasped for breath, one hand pressed against my chest, watching him straighten his jacket with the casual indifference of a man who'd simply delivered a package and was already thinking about his next stop. He turned without another word and walked back out through the broken door, disappearing down the front walk toward a dark sedan idling at the curb, and didn't look back once. I sat on the hallway floor for a long moment after his car pulled away, my shoulder throbbing where I'd hit the molding, my mind working through what I'd just heard with the same cold clarity I'd been forcing myself to maintain all week. $600,000. Friday. A threat that had nothing to do with forged documents or tampered pills, nothing to do with the slow, careful cruelty Juliet had been practicing on me for weeks. This was something faster, blunter, and considerably more dangerous than either of them had likely bargained for when they'd first decided to gamble with people who didn't extend second chances. I had less than 3 days now, not just to protect what remained of my own life, but to decide whether I was even willing to protect the 2 people who'd spent the last month trying to destroy it. I spent the night after Terrence Fox left, sitting at the kitchen table, with a legal pad doing something I hadn't let myself do in 3 weeks, thinking clearly and completely about the exact sequence of Mercy's final days, without the fog of grief I'd been letting myself hide inside since the funeral. If Juliet had been asking careful questions about heart medication weeks before Mercy died, if she'd been standing in my backyard tampering with my own pills with that same practiced precision, then the question I couldn't stop circling back to was simple and terrible in equal measure. How long had this actually been going on? And had it somehow already touched Mercy before it ever touched me? I remembered the name of the nurse who'd cared for her during those final 9 days, a young woman named Priscilla, who'd shown Mercy and me both a kindness that went well beyond what her job required, who'd sat with us through some of the hardest hours of that hospital stay, and never once made either of us feel like a burden. I found her number the next morning through the hospital's general line, explained who I was, and asked if she might have a few minutes to speak with me. She agreed without hesitation, her voice warm with recognition, the moment I gave her Mercy's name, and we arranged to meet at a diner near the hospital that afternoon, someplace neutral, where she felt comfortable talking outside her professional walls. Priscilla looked tired in the particular way nurses always seem to look, kind eyes set into a face that had clearly seen more grief than any one person should have to absorb and keep absorbing. She asked how I was holding up, and I told her honestly for once that I was still trying to understand exactly what had happened to my wife. She studied me for a moment before answering the way people do when they're deciding how much of the truth a grieving man can actually carry. "I think about your wife more than most patients, if I'm honest," she said. "She asked us questions nobody else on that floor bothered to ask, wanted to understand her own numbers, not just be told what to do. It's rare in my experience for a patient to want that much clarity about her own decline. She fought hard. Priscilla went on, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. Harder than her chart really accounted for, if I'm being honest. Her heart function had been more stable than we expected, right up until it wasn't. I asked her what she meant by that. She hesitated, the particular hesitation of someone weighing professional caution against a genuine desire to be helpful. "I probably shouldn't say too much without you going through proper channels," she said. "But since you're asking directly, her medication levels weren't tracking the way they should have been those last few weeks before she was admitted. We assumed it was just the progression of her condition. In hindsight, some of us talked about it afterward, wondered if something had been off with her outpatient regimen before she ever got to us. It happens sometimes. People miss doses or the dosage gets adjusted wrong somewhere along the line." My chest tightened around a question I almost couldn't make myself ask. "Would there be a record," I said, "of exactly what she'd been prescribed in those final months? Something I could actually look at?" Priscilla nodded slowly. "Her outpatient cardiologist would have that. Dr. Whitfield over at the clinic on Cherry Street. You'd need to request the full prescription and refill history. It's public record for family with the right paperwork. It might show you more than the hospital chart ever could, since we only saw her in that last stretch." I thanked her more than the moment probably called for, and she reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly before she left, telling me she was sorry again for my loss. The words landing differently this time than they had from anyone else who'd said them to me over the past month. I drove to Dr. Whitfield's clinic directly from the diner, my hands steady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been in days, the particular calm of a man who had finally found the exact instrument he needed to take the reading that mattered most. The office manager was sympathetic and efficient once I explained who I was and what I needed, and within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a small consultation room with a folder in front of me containing 4 months of prescription and refill records for Mercy Louise Raymond Shepard. I noticed my own hands shaking slightly as I reached for it, and I made myself set them flat on the table for a moment before I opened the folder the way I used to steady myself before reading a gauge I already suspected was about to tell me something I didn't want to know. I opened it with hands that had gone despite everything unsteady after all. The early months looked exactly as I would have expected: a consistent 30-day prescription refilled reliably on scheduled dosage, unchanged for years. Then, beginning almost exactly 4 months before her death, the pattern shifted. Refill requests submitted early, then later, then early again, an irregularity that meant nothing to an untrained eye, but that I recognized instantly, the same way I used to recognize the earliest signature of a system drifting slowly out of calibration before anyone else noticed anything wrong at all. I sat there in that small consultation room, the folder open on my lap, and understood that whatever I found next was going to change everything I thought I knew about how my wife had actually died. Dr. Whitfield came in a few minutes later, an older man with silver hair and the particular gentleness that comes from decades of delivering difficult news to frightened families. He'd reviewed my request with his office manager, he said, and wanted to speak with me directly before I looked through the rest of the file, given the questions I'd raised about the pattern in her refill history. "I want to be careful here," he said, sitting across from me, "because I can't tell you with certainty what caused the irregularity. What I can tell you is that your wife came to see me about 4 months before she passed, and she seemed different that visit. Distracted. She asked me near the end of our appointment whether I thought she was still of sound enough mind to make changes to a legal document without anyone able to contest it later. I felt something cold settle low in my chest. Did she say what document? She didn't specify, and I didn't press, but she mentioned she needed to see her attorney before the month was out. Said it twice, actually, like she wanted to make sure I understood it mattered. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to bring up during a cardiology visit, but patients say all sorts of things when they're frightened about their health. I assumed it was simply her mortality catching up with her the way it does with most people her age eventually." He paused. "She never made it back for her follow-up. We called twice. Someone else answered the second time, a family member, I believe, and told us she'd take a message. I sat with that for a long moment, the folder open on my lap, the pieces I'd been carrying separately for days finally sliding into a single unbearable shape. 4 months before she died, Mercy had wanted to see Lachlan Hart urgently enough to mention it twice to her cardiologist. 4 months before she died, her medication refill pattern had begun drifting out of its steady rhythm for the first time in years. And 4 months before she died was roughly the same window I now understood with sickening clarity in which Juliet had walked into a coffee shop on Levy Street, asking careful specific questions about heart medication and dosage. I thanked Dr. Whitfield, though I couldn't have said afterward what words I actually used, and I drove home without any memory of the roads I took to get there. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a long time before I went inside, running the sequence forward and backward, testing it the way I used to test a failure theory against every piece of data available before I'd let myself believe it. Mercy had grown wary of something, perhaps Juliet's spending, perhaps some small inconsistency only a careful woman like her would have noticed, and she decided quietly to go back to Lachlan and add protections to the trust before anyone else could touch it. Protections that would have named a different trustee, perhaps, or locked the terms in ways that made manipulation impossible. Whatever the specifics, Juliet must have found out. And a woman capable of emptying capsules into my garden dirt without her hands shaking was not a woman who would simply wait and hope Mercy changed her mind. 4 months of carefully adjusted medication, 4 months of a heart that had been by every account I'd now gathered more stable than it had any right to fail as suddenly as it had. I laughed. It came out of me before I understood what was happening, a short, strange, involuntary bark of sound that had nothing to do with anything being funny, my body's only available response to a fact too large for grief or rage to hold on their own. Then the laugh broke apart into something else entirely, and I sat in that driveway with my forehead against the steering wheel, my shoulders shaking, making no effort at all to perform composure for an audience that wasn't there. I don't know how long I stayed like that, long enough that the light outside had shifted noticeably by the time I lifted my head again. When I finally did, something in me had changed permanently, the way metal changes once it's been through enough pressure cycles to lose its original shape for good. I was no longer a grieving husband, trying quietly to understand what had happened to his wife. I was a man who had just confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that she had been murdered slowly, carefully by someone who'd sat across from her at Thanksgiving dinners and called her family. I thought about simply disappearing, selling nothing, confronting no one, taking what remained of my life somewhere quiet and far from Vicksburg, and letting Cedric and Juliet destroy themselves eventually without my having to be the instrument of it. I decided against it before I'd even finished considering it seriously. Mercy had spent 11 years being careful so that her family could be protected from exactly this kind of rot. Walking away now, letting Juliet simply inherit whatever remained after the dust settled, would mean her carefulness had died right alongside her accomplishing nothing at all. I was going to need Lachlan Hart again, and this time I wasn't going to Vicksburg to protect a piece of paper. I was going to make sure that whoever had done this to my wife answered for it in a room where the truth couldn't be argued away as an old man's confusion. Lachlan Hart cleared his afternoon the moment I called and told him in as few words as I could manage that I needed to see him about something considerably more serious than a piece of unregistered property. I drove to his office above the hardware store for the second time in as many weeks, though the man who walked up those stairs this time bore almost no resemblance to the confused, grieving widower who'd first climbed them. He met me at the door himself again, and whatever he saw in my face made him skip the pleasantries entirely, guiding me straight back to his private office and closing the door behind us before either of us had said a word. I told him everything: the forged power of attorney, the pill organizer, the capsules Juliet had refilled with something I still didn't have a name for, the gambling debt, the man who'd broken my chain lock and threatened to burn my house down with me inside it. And finally, the 4-month pattern in Mercy's prescription records the appointment she'd never made it back to the words she'd said twice to her cardiologist about needing to see her attorney before the month was out. Lachlan sat very still through most of it, his expression professionally composed right up until I mentioned the medication records, at which point something harder settled into his features, something that told me he was no longer thinking like a family attorney handling an estate dispute. "You understand what you're describing," he said quietly when I'd finished. "This isn't civil anymore, Alan. What you're describing, if it holds up, is a homicide investigation. That's not something I handle from this office. That's the district attorney forensic toxicology, a process that could take months and won't necessarily move as fast as you need it to right now." "I know," I said, "but I need something faster in the meantime. Cedric has 3 days before whoever he owes comes back with worse than a broken door chain. And I'm not interested in giving Juliet one more day of comfort thinking she's already won." Lachlan leaned back in his chair, turning a pen slowly between his fingers, the way he had the first time I'd sat across from him, weighing a problem before committing to a strategy. "The trust shares are already protected," he said. "Mercy structured that well enough 11 years ago that nothing Cedric or Juliet does can touch them. Forged power of attorney, or not, that document only grants authority over assets you personally hold, and those shares were never legally yours to begin with. They're still hers functionally, now passed to you through the trust mechanism she built. That part of this was never actually vulnerable." "Then what is?" "The house," he said. "That's the one asset in this whole picture that sits entirely in your name unprotected, and it's the one thing they've been trying hardest to move. If we want to take that off the table, permanently make it impossible for them to touch, no matter what forged paperwork they produce, we need to get it out of your name and into something they can't reach, quickly and quietly enough that they don't realize it's happened until it's already done." He explained the mechanism the way he might explain water pressure to another engineer, in terms I could follow without translation. A private holding entity structured through corporate proxies, rather than my own name established with enough legal insulation that ownership would become nearly impossible to trace back to me directly. Once the deed transferred, any sale Cedric or Juliet attempted would collapse the moment a title search revealed they no longer had a house to sell at all. "There's something else," Lachlan said before I could respond. "You mentioned the debt. 600,000, an unregulated lender-collector willing to threaten arson. That kind of debt is often for sale if you know where to look and you're willing to move fast. If we can identify the lender and purchase that obligation outright, we don't just protect Cedric from violence, we become his only creditor. Which means, functionally, we control the terms of exactly how and when that debt gets resolved." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I used to turn over an unfamiliar reading before trusting it. "You're saying I could buy my own son's debt?" "I'm saying you could own it," Lachlan said. "Whether that becomes leverage or mercy is entirely up to you. But either way, it takes the knife out of a stranger's hand and puts it into yours, where at least the person holding it has some reason to hesitate." I thought of Cedric's unsent message, the one he'd never had the courage to send. I know what we're doing to him, and I don't know how to stop it. I thought of the boy who used to call me Alan for a year before trusting the word, dad testing whether he truly belonged before he let himself believe it. "Do it," as I said. "The house first, the debt after, and Lachlan, I want this finished before Friday." He was already reaching for his phone before I'd finished speaking, already calling in whatever machinery a man like him kept in reserve for exactly this kind of urgency. And for the first time since I'd walked into my own living room and heard my son declare me too far gone to matter, I felt something that wasn't quite hope, but sat close enough beside it to matter. Cedric called me that evening, and I knew from the first sound of his breathing, before he'd said a single word, that something had shifted since I'd left Lachlan's office that afternoon. "Dad." His voice cracked on the single syllable, none of the careful composure he'd been managing for weeks. "Dad, I need you to listen to me. Something happened at the office today." I sat down slowly in my chair by the window, keeping my own voice as steady and confused as I'd trained myself to sound over the past 2 weeks, though every part of me had gone sharp and alert the moment I heard the fear in his. "What happened? Are you all right?" "There was a man," Cedric said, the words coming too fast now, tumbling over each other. He walked right into the office, past the receptionist, past everyone, and sat down across from my desk like he had a client meeting scheduled. He knew my name. He knew everything: the loan, the amount, how many payments I'd missed. He said if the money wasn't in by Friday, they weren't going to bother with the house next time. He said they'd come for me directly, wherever I was, whenever I was easiest to reach. I closed my eyes, picturing the tattooed man who'd broken my chain lock and pinned me against my own hallway wall, understanding immediately that Cedric had just received a version of the same visit, except delivered somewhere with witnesses, somewhere that had apparently frightened him enough to finally drop the careful performance he and Juliet had been maintaining with me for weeks. He said something else. Cedric continued, his voice dropping lower, as though he were checking over his shoulder even now. He said next time it wouldn't be a warning. He said guys like him don't usually give second visits. I let a silence sit there for a moment, partly because the frightened old man I was still performing wouldn't have known what to say immediately, and partly because I genuinely didn't. Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks watching this same son forge my signature and let his wife feed me, tampered medication, felt almost nothing at the news that danger had finally found him too. Another part of me, older and harder to silence, remembered a boy gripping my hand, crossing the street, terrified of nothing more serious than an oncoming car. "Cedric," I said finally, "why are you telling me this?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear him breathing unevenly on the other end. "Because I don't know who else to tell," he said, quieter now. "Juliet says we just need to hold on until Friday, that everything's handled, that the closing will cover it. But Dad, I don't think she's telling me everything anymore. I don't think she's told me everything in a long time." I thought of his unsent message still sitting in a drafts folder he probably didn't know I'd already read. I know what we're doing to him, and I don't know how to stop it. I wondered, listening to him now, whether this was the closest he'd come to actually reaching for help since he'd written those words and deleted the courage to send them. "Get some rest," I told him, keeping my voice gentle, uncertain even now whether gentleness was mercy or simply one more layer of the performance I couldn't yet afford to drop. "We'll figure it out." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long while, afterward turning the conversation over the way I'd turn over any new reading that didn't quite match what I'd expected. Terrence Fox escalating to Cedric's workplace changed the shape of my timeline considerably. Lachlan had told me the house transfer and the debt purchase would take until Friday to fully execute, moving as fast as legally possible without triggering suspicion. Now it sounded like Friday might already be too late for Cedric, regardless of what happened with the house. I thought about Juliet telling him everything was handled, that the closing would cover it, and wondered whether she actually believed that herself, or whether it was simply one more careful lie in a long list of them delivered to keep her husband compliant a few days longer than his conscience could otherwise stand. I thought too about how strange it was to feel something close to protectiveness toward the son who'd forged my signature, even as I understood exactly what that protectiveness was likely to cost me if I let it slow me down. I called Lachlan back within the hour and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment on the other end, the particular quiet of a man recalculating variables he'd already thought he'd accounted for. "I can move the debt purchase up," he said finally. "I have a contact who handles exactly this kind of transaction. Buys distressed private loans, moves fast, doesn't ask unnecessary questions about motive. I can likely have that piece settled by tomorrow afternoon instead of Friday. The house transfer needs a bit more time regardless, but the debt is the piece keeping that man showing up at your son's office. Settle that first and the immediate danger goes away even before the rest of this is finished." "Do it," I said again, the same 2 words I'd used that afternoon, though they felt different now, carrying a weight I hadn't fully anticipated when I'd first spoken them. I was no longer simply protecting a piece of property or preserving evidence for whatever reckoning was still coming. I was, for reasons I couldn't entirely untangle, even from myself, still trying to keep my son safe from consequences he had, in every meaningful sense, brought entirely upon himself. I told myself that made me a fool. I told myself that more than once that night, and I still couldn't quite make myself believe it was the wrong thing to do. Lachlan called me the following afternoon to confirm the debt had been purchased quietly, cleanly through a contact who handled these things without asking unnecessary questions, exactly as promised. The house transfer, he said, needed one more day to finish properly the paperwork moving through channels designed specifically not to draw attention. I thanked him and hung up, and sat for a while afterward, absorbing the particular strangeness of owning. Owning in some legal sense, I still didn't fully grasp the mechanics of my own son's $600,000 mistake. Cedric and Juliet came by that evening together, carrying the same leather portfolio Juliet had been carrying since the memorial, though something in her posture had changed since I'd last seen her. A tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the look of a woman whose careful timeline had started slipping without her fully understanding why. Cedric, for his part, looked worse than I'd seen him look, yet the confrontation at his office apparently still sitting heavy on him, dark half circles under his eyes that no amount of composure could fully disguise. "We found a buyer," Juliet said, settling onto the sofa across from my chair with the portfolio open on her lap. "A lovely young family, actually. They're prepared to close quickly, which, given everything, felt like the right thing for all of us. We just need your consent on the sale paperwork and we can have this handled by the end of the week." I understood watching her that she had no idea yet what Lachlan and I had already done to the ground she was standing on. The knowledge sat in my chest like something physical, heavy, and satisfying in a way I didn't examine too closely. "Of course," I said, letting my voice waver exactly the amount I'd practiced reaching for the pen Cedric held out to me. "Whatever you two think is best. I trust you." I watched something pass between them at those words, relief. Mostly, though, I thought I saw something flicker across Cedric's face that looked closer to shame. I positioned the pen over the signature line and let my hand tremble, deliberately producing a jagged, uncertain scrawl that bore only a passing resemblance to my actual signature, the mark of a man whose mind had genuinely started slipping. Juliet watched me sign with an expression of quiet, contained satisfaction, and I understood, watching her watch me, that she believed this was the final obstacle standing between her and whatever came next. She tucked the signed papers back into her portfolio, and the two of them stayed another 20 minutes, making the kind of hollow conversation people make when they believe a difficult thing has just become considerably easier. Cedric asked if I'd eaten dinner. Juliet mentioned casually something about the movers coming by early next week to begin packing, and I nodded along, playing my part, while inside I cataloged every detail with the same careful attention I used to give a system reading I didn't yet fully trust. They left a little after 8, Juliet's sedan pulling out of the driveway with the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. I waited until the sound of the engine faded down the street before I moved. I'd bought the small device from an electronics shop in Jackson 2 days earlier on my way back from Lachlan's office, a compact audio recorder no larger than a coin, equipped with a directional microphone sensitive enough to pick up a conversation from several feet away. I'd read the instructions twice, tested it in my own kitchen, until I understood exactly how it worked and carried it in my shirt pocket every day, since waiting for the right moment. I crossed to the coffee table where Juliet had signed her name to countless careful lies over the past several weeks, knelt down and felt along the underside of the heavy wooden frame until I found a recessed groove near one of the support legs, invisible from any angle a person would normally look. It was the same table where Cedric had once spread his glossy nursing home brochure, the same table where Juliet had first said in front of 30 witnesses that her father-in-law was too far gone to know what was happening anymore. There was a particular satisfaction in choosing that exact surface, though I couldn't have explained it fully even to myself. I pressed the small adhesive backing of the device firmly against the wood, checked that it held securely, and stepped back to study the placement from every angle I could think of. It was completely invisible, exactly as I'd hoped. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door behind me out of habit rather than necessity, and sat down on the edge of the bed with the small wireless receiver Lachlan's associate had recommended, testing the connection until a faint, steady hum confirmed the microphone was transmitting clearly. Tomorrow, if my instincts about Cedric and Juliet's habits held true, they would come back here to finalize whatever remained of their plan, believing the house was as good as sold and their debt as good as forgotten. They would sit on that sofa across from that coffee table and speak freely the way people do in a room they believe belongs entirely to them. I intended to be listening to every single word. They came back the next evening exactly as I had anticipated, letting themselves in with the spare key while I sat in my bedroom with the small receiver pressed to my ear, the earpiece Lachlan's associate had given me, fitting snugly enough that I barely noticed it after the first few minutes. I'd spent most of the afternoon rehearsing what I might hear, bracing myself the way I used to brace for a pressure test on an old section of pipe, uncertain whether it would hold or whether the whole thing would simply give way the moment real weight was applied to it. I heard the front door close, the particular creak of the sofa cushions absorbing weight, the soft clink of glasses that told me Juliet had brought wine again, the same casual celebration I imagined they'd been rehearsing in their minds since the moment I'd signed those papers the night before. I still can't quite believe how easy that was. Cedric said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone close enough to the table that I could hear the particular exhaustion underneath his relief. I thought he was going to ask more questions, read the whole thing line by line the way he used to read every contract before he'd sign anything. "Ika, I told you there was nothing to worry about," Juliet said, and even through the small speaker in my ear, I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, unmistakable and entirely without apology. "Your father's been checked out for weeks now, Cedric. He signed that consent form like a man who'd already forgotten what a house even was." I sat very still on the edge of my bed, listening to a woman describe my own mind as something already gone, something already conveniently absent from the equation she'd spent months constructing. "So what happens now?" Cedric asked. "With the closing, I mean. When does the money actually clear?" "Tomorrow morning," Juliet said, her tone sharpening into something businesslike. "The buyer's attorney confirmed everything's in order on their end. Funds transfer at closing, and once that clears escrow, we're finally done with all of this. The debt gets paid off in full, and we can actually breathe again." There was a pause on the recording long enough that I could hear the soft clink of a glass being set down on the wooden surface directly above where the device sat hidden. "And after that," Cedric said, his voice dropping into something quieter, something that sounded less like relief and more like a question he'd been avoiding asking out loud. "What happens to him? Once the money's moved, once we don't need his signature on anything else?" I felt my whole body go still, waiting. "We handle the rest the way we discussed," Juliet said evenly. "There's a facility outside Jackson that can accommodate him comfortably. It's not the same as the brochure we showed him, obviously, but it's appropriate for someone in his condition. We can arrange the transfer within the week once everything else is settled." "He's not actually that far gone, Juliet." Cedric's voice cracked slightly on the words, quiet enough that I had to strain to catch them clearly. "I know we've been telling everyone that. I know I've been telling myself that. But some days I look at him and he seems almost exactly like he always was, and I don't know how to square that with what we're doing to him. Sometimes I catch him looking at me a certain way, and for a second, I think he knows something, and then it passes and I tell myself I am imagining it, because the alternative is too much to sit with." The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. "Are you having second thoughts?" Juliet asked, her voice losing its warmth, entirely dropping into something flat and testing. "I don't know what I'm having," Cedric said. "I just keep thinking about Mom, about how much she trusted him, about how she'd feel if she could see what we've turned into since she died." "Your mother isn't here to see anything," Juliet said, sharper now, an edge in her voice I hadn't heard from her before, not even during the memorial. We did what we had to do, Cedric. We're almost through it. This is not the moment to start unraveling. I know, Cedric said, and I could hear something give way in his voice, some final piece of resistance folding under the weight of everything else. I know, you're right. I'm sorry. I just needed to say it out loud once. Say it to me and only me, Juliet said, and then let it go. We're one day away from being free of all of this. Don't lose your nerve now, not when we're this close. I sat there in the dark of my own bedroom, listening to my son apologize for the last flicker of conscience he had left, listening to the woman he'd married talk him back into a plan that had already cost one life and was preparing with chilling calm to end mine in a facility neither of them had ever bothered to actually visit. I heard the soft sound of glasses clinking together one final time. A toast to a victory that existed only inside a lie they hadn't yet discovered had already collapsed. I pulled the earpiece from my ear and set it carefully on the nightstand, my hands steadier than I expected them to be given everything I'd just heard. I sat there a long while in the dark, turning the recording over in my mind, the way I'd turn over any completed instrument reading, checking it against everything I already knew, satisfied that it confirmed what I no longer had any doubt about. Tomorrow was the closing. Tomorrow, they believed, was the day they finally won. I intended to make very sure it became instead the day they finally lost everything they'd been willing to destroy me to keep. I dressed carefully the next morning, choosing the dark charcoal suit I hadn't worn since Mercy's funeral, a crisp white shirt, a conservative tie I knotted with hands that had gone perfectly steady for the first time in weeks. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment before I left the house, hardly recognizing the man staring back at me, not the frail, confused widower I'd been performing for 3 weeks, and not quite the grieving husband I'd been before any of this started either. Someone new had assembled himself somewhere in between, and I intended for that man to walk into that closing room today. I thought briefly of Mercy standing behind me in that same mirror countless mornings over 30 years, straightening my collar before church, and wondered whether she'd recognize the man in front of her now, or whether grief and betrayal had simply carved him into someone entirely new. The brokerage occupied the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Jackson, all polished marble and abstract art, meant to project a wealth I no longer had any interest in being impressed by. I arrived early exactly as Lachlan had instructed, waited near a large potted plant in the lobby with a clear line of sight into the glass-walled conference room where Cedric and Juliet sat at a long table, checking their phones, waiting for a buyer who was never actually going to arrive. At exactly 9 o'clock, the elevator doors opened, and Lachlan stepped out in a navy suit carrying his leather briefcase with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this exact kind of work more times than either of us could count. He caught my eye and gave a single sharp nod before crossing the marble floor toward the conference room, and I fell into step a few paces behind him, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been since before Mercy's diagnosis. I reached the glass door first. I put my hand on the handle, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The effect was immediate. Juliet's polite professional smile shattered the instant her eyes found me standing there in a suit, rather than the robe and slippers she'd grown accustomed to seeing me shuffle around in. Cedric actually flinched a sharp intake of breath, audible even across the room, his phone slipping from his fingers onto the table with a clatter neither of them bothered to acknowledge. I said nothing. I simply stood there letting them absorb exactly what they were looking at, a man who was not, in fact, too far gone to know what was happening anymore. I thought in that brief silence of every performance I'd given over the past 3 weeks, the trembling hands, the unfocused eyes, the slow shuffle down my own hallway, and understood that this stillness, this deliberate refusal to fill the silence with anything at all, was the truest thing I'd done in that house since the day I'd read Mercy's letter in a locked metal room. The young broker, seated at the head of the table, glanced between us, clearly confused by the sudden tension that had hijacked what he'd expected to be a routine closing. Juliet's hand moved toward her purse, toward her phone, some instinct telling her, I imagined that whatever was happening had already spiraled beyond anything she could smooth over with the right tone of voice. The door opened again behind me. Lachlan stepped through, setting his briefcase down on the table with a solid, deliberate click of its brass latches. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had already won an argument nobody else in the room yet understood they were having. Lachlan Hart, representing the Raymond Family Trust, and more recently a private holding entity that acquired title to this property 4 days ago. Cedric repeated the word title back to him, his voice hollow, uncomprehending. "You cannot sell a house you no longer own," Lachlan said simply. "Mr. Shepard transferred this property out of his personal name over the course of last week through channels entirely separate from any documents the two of you have had him sign since. The consent form you obtained last night is worthless. He hasn't owned this house since before you asked for his signature on it." Juliet's composure, which I had watched hold firm through funerals and forged documents and a month of carefully rehearsed lies, finally cracked completely. "That's not possible," she said, her voice climbing toward something sharp and desperate. "We have power of attorney. We have a forged power of attorney," Lachlan said, cutting through her with the same calm precision he'd used explaining trust mechanics to me days earlier. "Only grants authority over assets the principal still personally holds. Mr. Shepard hasn't held this house in any legal sense for 4 days. You've spent this entire morning attempting to sell a property belonging to a private corporation." I watched the color drain from Cedric's face as the full weight of what Lachlan had just said settled over him, and for one brief moment I thought I saw something almost like relief underneath the horror, the particular relief of a man whose slow collapse had finally been taken out of his own hands entirely. Juliet looked at me, then really looked at me for what I believe was the first time since I'd walked through that door. Whatever she saw in my face made her sit back down slowly in her chair, her hand still hovering uselessly near her phone, as though some part of her had already understood that whatever call she'd been about to make would arrive far too late to matter. The glass door behind Lachlan opened one final time. 2 men in plain dark suits stepped through the doorway, and though neither wore a visible badge, something in their posture told everyone in that room exactly what they were before either of them spoke a single word. Lachlan had explained the arrangement to me 2 days earlier, that the medical records in Priscilla's account, combined with the forged power of attorney and the recorded conversation from the night before, had been enough to secure the district attorney's office moving on an emergency basis, treating the financial fraud as the fastest available charge, while the toxicology investigation into Mercy's death proceeded in parallel. The taller of the 2 agents produced a set of steel handcuffs, the sharp metallic sound of them cutting cleanly through the stunned silence of the conference room. "Juliet Zhang," he said, "you're under arrest for wire fraud forgery and attempted grand theft by deception in connection with the attempted sale of property you did not legally control." Juliet's legs seemed to give out from beneath her the moment the cuffs closed around her wrists. She sagged against the edge of the table, a raw, wordless sound escaping her that bore no resemblance to the composed, controlled woman who'd once stood in my living room and calmly announced that I was too far gone to know what was happening. Whatever mask she'd been wearing for the better part of a year had finally completely come apart. Cedric didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply sank down onto his knees on the polished floor, his expensive suit crumpling around him, his hands covering his face as deep broken sobs began tearing through his chest. I watched my son collapse in front of me, and I searched honestly for some flicker of the satisfaction I'd imagined I might feel in this exact moment. I found none. I found only a bottomless grief that had been waiting patiently underneath the anger this entire time. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a desperation I hadn't seen from him since he was a small boy afraid of the dark. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking into something high and broken. "I'm sorry. Please, you have to stop this. I'm your son." I looked down at him for a long moment, searching my own chest for any remaining trace of the father who'd taught this boy to fish off the levee, who'd sat up with him through fevers, who'd cried harder at his business school graduation than at his own wedding. "This house stopped being yours 4 days ago," I said, and every word landed with a weight I hadn't planned, but couldn't have softened even if I'd wanted to. "And you stopped being my son the day you let your wife tell people I was too far gone to understand what was happening to me, while the two of you were quietly poisoning your mother's medication so she couldn't change her will before you needed her to die." Cedric's face went white, then crumpled entirely, a fresh wave of anguish breaking over him as he understood completely and finally that I knew everything. Not just the forged documents, not just the pills meant for me. All of it going back 4 months to a woman who had asked her cardiologist twice whether she still had the right to protect her own family. "I didn't know," he said, the words coming out in a broken whisper. "Dad, I swear to you, I didn't know what Juliet was. Actually, I thought it was just the house, just the money. I never would have—" "You knew enough," I said quietly. "You knew enough to write a message to a therapist you never had the courage to send. You knew enough to feel guilty every single day and keep going anyway. Not knowing everything isn't the same as not knowing anything, Cedric." The second agent pulled him gently but firmly to his feet, securing his wrists behind his back while he continued to sob, repeating my name over and over in a voice that no longer sounded like the confident son who'd once stood in my living room delivering rehearsed cruelty to an audience of witnesses. I stood perfectly still as they walked both of them out through the marble lobby past a receptionist who'd gone completely silent past the young broker, still sitting frozen at the table, understanding only now the full scope of what his mourning had actually become. I watched the elevator doors close on my son's face, tear-streaked and finally entirely honest, and I felt something inside my chest release that I hadn't fully realized had been clenched shut for 3 straight weeks. Lachlan stood beside me quietly, giving me the space that particular silence required before he finally spoke. "It's over," he said. "The rest is paperwork now. Toxicology will take time, but with what we already have, I don't believe there's any real doubt about how this ends." I nodded, though I couldn't yet find any words to answer him with. I thought of Mercy's letter still folded in the drawer of my nightstand, her handwriting steady and careful, even in a message meant to be read after her death. I thought about the words she'd used to describe herself, careful and understood, standing in that marble lobby with my son's sobs still echoing faintly in my memory, that I had finally become exactly as careful as she'd always needed me to be. 3 weeks and 1 entire lifetime too late to save her. But perhaps if there was any mercy left in any of this, not too late to matter. I looked out through the tall windows at the far end of the lobby down at the city stretching below, and thought about the empty house waiting for me back in Vicksburg, quieter now than it had ever been. And yet for the first time since Mercy died, no longer haunted by anything I hadn't already faced directly. Whatever came next, whatever grief and reckoning still lay ahead in the coming months of hearings and testimony, I understood that the worst of it, the not knowing, had finally ended in that glass room, 35 years of reading pressure gauges, finally telling me the one truth I'd needed most. The pressure gauge sits on a shelf in the small storefront office of the fund I started that spring. 3 months later, its brass casing polished, its needle resting permanently at 0. Nobody who walks past it ever asks what it measured or why an old man insisted on donating it instead of keeping it for himself. It simply sits quiet, done with its work. I used to believe that raising a child with equal love, equal fairness, and no distinction at all between blood and choice was enough to guarantee loyalty in return, that if I simply did the work of fatherhood honestly, the outcome would take care of itself, the way a well-built system holds its pressure without needing constant watching. I understand now that love, however honest, cannot reach into a wound a person refuses to name out loud. Some cracks don't show on the surface reading. They only show when the whole system finally fails, and by then the only thing left to measure is how much damage came through before anyone noticed. I think about Mercy every single day, and I like to believe wherever she is that God let her see the end of it, not the poison, not the forged papers, but the part where I finally became the kind of